Good afternoon and welcome to our monthly third Thursday Lunch and Learn program at the Institute for Holocaust Education. I'm honored to introduce Dr. Chad Gibbs. He serves as director of the Zucker Goldberg Center for Holocaust Studies, an assistant professor of Jewish Studies at the Yaschik and Arnold Jewish Studies Program at the College of Charleston. His presentation is titled "To Live and to Tell: Resistance at Treblinka and its Legacies," which addresses his ongoing research that began as a master's student at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. Dr. Gibbs.
Well, thank you for the introduction. I just wanted to stress that Omaha connection. It's good to be at least virtually back in Omaha, kind of where this project began, working with Dr. Mark Sellensack's predecessor, Waitman Bourne, when he was at College of Charleston. So I was there, or I'm sorry, when he was at University of Nebraska. I was there from 2013 to 2016. And the project I'm going to tell you about, which is now in the manuscript revision phase, began as my MA there. It was, I think, what's kind of become interesting to me, at least on the inside, is it was the third idea I picked to Dr. Bourne. Pitched, I should say. Third idea I pitched to Dr. Bourne. I pitched one on memorialization by German people, but not the German state. So when Germans wanted to do memorialization on their own, I think I backed away from that one because at the time I was worried about how good my German is. I should have realized that wouldn't eventually be a problem. Then I pitched another one about wanting to learn about the history of Holocaust education in the United States, and Dr. Bourne thought maybe that was too present, too new. So then I went back to the fact that I had visited Treblinka as an undergraduate student on a study abroad trip in 2011, and I was fascinated by it from there on out. They had, at the time, literally what you would look at as a food truck in the parking lot of Treblinka's Memorial Museum that was selling books. And I bought like 3 books in that parking lot and had read almost all the way through all of them by the time we got to our next destination on the train. It was something I wanted to know more about, and I pitched the idea to Dr. Bourne, and his worry was, you probably can't do research on that place because you won't find enough sources. And I'm a former combat engineer. I was in the Army for almost 10 years, retired from the Army in 2009, and I had a little bit of a stubborn streak, and I took that as like a challenge. Can I find enough material? And part of what you'll hear today is that I eventually ended up finding enough material, and the little push that he gave me got me down this road. So with that kind of background, let me share my screen and I'll start to tell you about my research on resistance at Treblinka. So let me maximize this. So one of the things I want to tell you before I even go on is, to look at, even though we have a black and white photo here, look at the color of that column of smoke. We can tell even in a black and white photo that's not of fantastic quality that this is a dark smoke. It's not like a white smoke. We definitely have some form of accelerant fire, and that is a part of the story of the day of the revolt at Treblinka. So this is the only known picture of that event. It was taken by a Polish, non-Jewish member of the Polish underground resistance named Franciszek Zabecki, who was working as a station master at the Treblinka-Malkinia train station, and took this photograph on August 2nd, 1943, when he saw that huge pile of smoke coming out of the camp. He knew that something must have been going on, so he snapped this shot, and this is basically the only visual evidence of that entire day. So just for those who may not be really read in on what Treblinka represents and where it fits into the story of the Holocaust. I'll take a step back, well back from that day on August 2nd, 1943, to talk to you a little bit about Aktion Reinhard, what Operation Reinhard or Aktion Reinhard was. So there are now, we know, 47,000 camps and ghettos spread throughout Nazi-occupied or Nazi-controlled Europe. This is part, we're finding out more and more about how many there were as part of a long ongoing project by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. So that number is going up all the time. These are, for the most part, small labor camps. They're deadly, but they are not extermination camps. They're something different. They're concentration camps, forced labor camps, and various other functions. When it comes to the word that we've come to hear a lot, death camp or extermination camp, that's only 6. I don't want to minimize that. There are massively lethal places, but there are 6 purpose-built extermination centers. So the 3 with gray outlines here, Kulmhof or Chelmno, as you probably know it, Lublin Majdanek, and Auschwitz. Those are extermination camps that are outside of this Aktion Reinhard system. They're not under this separate part of the Nazi camp system. So Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belzec, going from north to south there. Just as a question before I go on, because it'll be important when I talk about maps, can you all see my cursor when I'm doing this? Okay, good enough. So Aktion Reinhard comes about as a Nazi decision to move away from mass shootings. Maybe many of you have read Father Patrick Dubois' books, his book, The Holocaust by Bullets. We're talking about Nazi decision to move away from that phase of the Holocaust, if you will. So they had already murdered between 1.5 and 2 million Jewish people in occupied Eastern territories by rifle shot, one-on-one intimate killings in that way. And in their own minds, not deciding that mass murder was at all wrong, but deciding that the process of mass murder was in that way too difficult or came with challenges they wanted to avoid, they hold a meeting we now call the Wannsee Conference. And at that meeting, the decision to build what becomes known as Aktion Reinhard is disseminated to the men sitting around that table. And those 3 camps that are run under Aktion Reinhard, or Operation Reinhard, named for Reinhard Heydrich, who runs that conference, are Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. So you can see the dates that they operated. They did physically exist, usually longer than these dates, but this is the days that through which Jewish people were being sent by train load to those places. 3 days from, it's actually a typo, I'm sorry, that should be July 1942 to November 1943. So between July 23rd, we're coming up on the anniversary, July 23rd, 1942 through November, and that's counting some months where the camp was just being closed and cleaned up. That's when Treblinka existed. It's the 3rd of these camps to open, and it is the most refined in the sense of, terribly unfortunately, it's the one that does what the Nazis wanted to do the best of all of their camps. So it is, that's the reason why you can look at these horrific death toll numbers here. 434,000 at least at Belzec, Sobibor, a very wide range, kind of unknown total. I could put the lower range of Treblinka, but I don't normally, because I think I'm pretty confident in the high number of near 925,000. So Treblinka, everything else aside, is the 2nd most lethal place in the entire Holocaust, second only to the Auschwitz camp system, which takes between 1.1 and 1.3 million lives. Another thing that I want to talk about is different about these camps is that comparison with Auschwitz is really demonstrative. I'll get to that in a second. Where they put these three places is really a matter of, for them, for the Nazi regime, convenience for the plan that they had in mind. So if you look at the three of them on the map of what they called the general government of occupied Poland, they are near major Jewish population centers and along rail lines. And the third criteria for wanting where they would put one is that they be in some way rural or out of the way, that they just not be somewhere with a great deal of witnesses or individuals who could report on what's going on there. So Treblinka is way up here in the north, and one of the other reasons that it's the most lethal of the three is that it is near Warsaw, and that 1,000-year history of Jewish life in Warsaw is in many ways just terribly ended at Treblinka. This is where the population of Warsaw Jews is sent, is Treblinka. So this big difference between Auschwitz and those other three, I should say, extermination camps can be kind of summed up in what's going on in this picture. This is a picture of the ramp at Auschwitz. It's taken within the last 6 months of operations at Auschwitz. We can tell because we know when these rail lines were built. So these are most likely, actually, I'm pretty sure they are Hungarian Jews that are being unloaded at Auschwitz here. And you can tell already that a few things are going on. Certainly one thing has already taken place. On the left here, we have women and children, and on the right, we have men. So they've already separated people in gender. They've put all of the younger children with the women, and boys, maybe 14 years of age or older, depending on how big they were, are already over here with the men. The next thing that's going to happen under his watch, this is Mengele, is that these people are going to be, you've seen it probably in a lot of films, there's going to be that moment where individuals are judged in mere seconds on whether or not they're able to work. And those who aren't able to work are going to be sent in one direction, and those who are able to work will be sent into the camp. So if a person gets there and they're thought, quote, able to work, then they go to the phase of being tattooed, being held in quarantine, and then eventually given some form of job. And still, even for those people, the life expectancy at a place like Auschwitz is frighteningly short. But at Treblinka, the big difference is that none of this ever took place. Arrival at Treblinka is a very, very different proposition. So we don't have pictures of the inside of Treblinka operating like at Auschwitz here. This comes from what's called the Auschwitz album that you could look up in the major archives. But we have some sort of digital artists' reconstructions of what the areas of arrival and different parts of how Treblinka worked, how they operate. You can actually find a pretty good short digital video on YouTube of how Treblinka functioned. This is the arrival area. It's the place kind of best compared to where I was just showing you at Auschwitz. And what would go on here, I'll explain to you how the Germans operated Treblinka, and then from there on, we start into how do you put together resistance at a place like this, which I think is always inspiring and fascinating and just amazing what they were able to do. So we just have to understand how the Nazis operate this place so that we can put in perspective what Jews inside Treblinka were able to accomplish. So this in the foreground here, as I'm sure you can tell, is a row of boxcars. Trains sent to Treblinka. Usually, let's just say on a normal day, 6,000 people would be on one train. The trains would be 60 cars long, but would be broken into 20-car sections and brought into the camp, one 20-car section at a time. That's how large the ramp was. So they had to break it down into 3 different parts. Individuals being brought off the train would be rushed as fast as possible, because part of trying to keep people from resisting or knowing what's happening to them is to make them move as fast as they possibly can. It's just a fact of humanity that we don't come up with our best plans at a run. So they're forcing people to run in through this open gate, forcing them under blows and shouts into this central courtyard area, which is called the arrival area, arrival plaza, you could say. And then this building on the left is a building in which they forced women and children to undress. Men were left out in the open, and that goes for any time of year. It didn't matter what the temperature was. Adult men had to undress out in the open here. Always attempting to maintain the ruse that this was not a murder factory. They always told people, you're going into the shower, you need to keep your clothing together. Here's a red string, tie your shoes together so that you'll be able to regather them after your shower is over. Women were brought into this building. The end of it, this area changed locations a couple of times during the operations of Treblinka, but for most of the time that this was done, say the last 20 feet of this building were a walled off barber shop, quote unquote, where women's hair was shaved off or clipped off, really. And then they were made to move along the path to the gas chamber. Just behind this building, right there through a gate, is a fenced path that the Germans called alternatively the Schlauch, which is the German for tube, or called it in their terrible sense of humor, the Himmelstrasse, which means the road to heaven. So they would force people to go running up that path, keeping them moving quickly so that they wouldn't have time to think about what might be coming next. That whole path, like you can see in these fences here, is woven with pine branches. One of the conspirators in the Treblinka revolt who survived was an amazing man named Richard Glazar. And Glazar wrote a memoir after the war called Trap with a Green Fence. These fences were so much his memory of the camp that he titled his memoir Trap with a Green Fence after this. So once women were undressed, shaved, and men had already gone up the path. Men were usually gassed before women because they thought that if men caught on to what was being done to women, there could be resistance. They were always thinking of ways to forestall resistance. So at the end of that path, of course, over here, kind of behind these pine trees, is the gas chamber building. There were two buildings over the time that Treblinka operated. There's the smaller old gas chamber building that's right here, and then the newer one that replaced it is right here, which is much, much larger. There are 3 gas chambers in this building. There are 10 in this one, but they quickly found that the structure was so efficient and capacious that they only ever used 5 at a time. The 5 on one side of a hallway were just not used because they weren't necessary. Men would go first, as I said, and then women were sent up with children or sent up that path afterwards. This place, though, we'll come back to a bit more of how this place functions at other parts of the map, and especially in Q&A if you have any questions afterwards. But this is where resistance begins, because let's talk about that selection comparison again. So if there's a selection at Auschwitz, it's being done by that doctor that we showed a picture of, and of course these SS men that are standing around with them. They're all doing that selection for who's capable of work, who's not, and moving things along in their own way. Here, there's not supposed to be a selection because the camp has no labor functions other than what labor is necessary to actually operate the camp. This place doesn't produce tires for the Nazi war effort like Auschwitz did. It doesn't make anything other than the proceeds of killing people. That requires a bit of a workforce, but not a large one. So replacements are not brought into this camp all the time. When they are, it's in small groups. It's ones, twos, threes. It's just a couple of few people to replace someone who had been killed by a guard or who had taken their own life out of desperation, or perhaps had passed away from the camp conditions. So how does this enter into resistance? When they needed a new person, when Jewish laborers inside Treblinka needed a new person on the work detail, they would pick their own. It's Jews at Treblinka who do the selection usually. Quite often, neglectful guards or guards that take no interest in who the camp workforce is, just allow a Jewish foreman or other kind of leader to say, we need this guy. I know from knowing him pre-war that he could do X, Y, or Z. And then the guard just signs off on bringing in that person. Well, what does that accomplish? That means that the person being brought into the camp is immediately a person who's trusted by the existing camp workforce, and they're picking their own social network, basically, of resistance. You need to think of social network aside from apps in today's environment. We're talking here about relationships between individuals that you could trust. And when you're in a camp like Treblinka, trust is the first link in the chain of being able to put together some form of resistance or uprising. So their ability to pick, to bring in individuals that they actually trust, gives them a lot of, gives them, being the Jewish workers inside of Treblinka, a lot of influence on who ends up in the camp, and a lot of influence on who they can actually trust within it. So if you'll pardon how bad I am at graphic design here, this is my attempt to show you a bit of the network of trust between individuals at Treblinka. So this man in this kind of blurry picture here, you see him wearing glasses. He's got an overcoat strung over his shoulders. He's wearing a suit. It's actually the only known photo of him. His name is Alfred Golewski, and it was taken in a pre-war skiing trip. I've actually cut him out of standing there with two friends. He ended up in Treblinka from its earliest days and being appointed by the Germans as Lagerälteste, which is German for camp elder, or highest ranking Jewish prisoner. And he's usually at selection, if you want to call it that. He's usually at the point of disembarkation. He's there when people are being taken off the trains. So he's the one who often points to someone and goes, oh, we need that person, or we need this guy. He can do X, Y, or Z. So Samuel Reisman, sometimes Shmuel Reisman, depending on which source, is one of the people that he has them bring into the camp. Morton Mattel is another. Barak Reisman is as well. A person named Jerzy, who unfortunately has no known photograph. Alfred Bem is a close confidant of his. And a couple of these stories of how Jews had influence over selection that I can tell you that I think are kind of inventive are one of the individuals, Golewski, has them choose. He tells them, oh, you're having trouble understanding new people brought in off these trains. Here's a man I know who works as a translator. Take him. Well, the man he pointed out who, quote unquote, works as a translator he wasn't even multilingual. That's how much the Germans were paying attention. The man's brought in to be a quote unquote translator, doesn't even speak the languages necessary for that, never did. The opportunity to even work in that, never comes up. Clearly, if they were supervising, they would have figured that out. Alfred Bem was a confidant of Golewski. He actually worked for a while as Golewski's personal assistant, is the nicest way we could say it, his servant inside of Treblinka. He was a high enough ranking prisoner that the Nazis allowed him to have someone who personally worked for him. And Bem also worked on that arrival ramp, handing out the red pieces of string you were supposed to tie your shoes together with. And as Samuel Willenberg here, who wrote this book, Revolt in Treblinka, was getting off the train, he saw Alfred Bem. The two had known each other in pre-war life. It's one of the amazing pay it forward sort of stories of Treblinka. Alfred Bem was a very small German Jewish boy who was forced over into Poland in the early years of the Nazi regime. His family fled into Poland and lived there after Hitler had come to power. And Willenberg, who was always a very imposing person, he was the last survivor of the Treblinka revolt alive. He died in his late 90s. He was referred to as a tough guy by several of the other prisoner survivors who remember him. And that held true on the streets of Częstochowa, Poland, where he came upon Alfred Bem being beaten up by Polish anti-Semitic kids one day. And Samuel Willenberg evidently beat up these 3 Polish anti-Semites and saved Alfred Bem from that. They became some level of friends after that, enough to at least know each other when Willenberg was stepping off the train. Willenberg gets off that train and asks Bem, what do I do to save myself? And Bem says, tell them you're a bricklayer. Willenberg was everything but a bricklayer, but he happened to be wearing, for warmth, his father, who was a painter, happened to be wearing one of his white smocks with paint on it. The Germans took this as evidence that he must be some sort of tradesman and agreed to the idea of bringing him in by saying he was a bricklayer. So Bem saves Willenberg. Willenberg is connected to Glazar. Reisman saved by being said that he's a translator. And all of these people, not just brought in off of the ramp because I'm picking a friend, all of these people become part of the resistance. And one of the amazing quotes of this day is that one of the people Galewski saved from arrival at Treblinka didn't take him very long to discover that his wife and children, who he had also arrived with, had been murdered in the gas chamber on the same day that he arrived. And he took Galewski aside, according to his own memoir, and yelled at him for having saved his life. He did not want to be alive if the rest of his family had been murdered. And why? What he yells at Galewski is, why keep me alive in this hell just for another couple of days? And Galewski, he says, told him, I didn't keep you alive just to save you. I saved you to, quote, sell your life at a higher price. And the MA that I wrote at University of Nebraska, I actually titled To Sell Your Life at a Higher Price. That was my first major writing about Treblinka. I went under that title. So Galewski told him that saving him was to sell his life at that higher price, and that higher price being to make him a part of a resistance that could actually stop this camp from working. So how do you go about doing that? You bring in some people that you trust. You've done that on the ramp at Treblinka. You bring in others from the existing work details that maybe you think are trustworthy. And what are those work details? Because this becomes very, very important to getting access to the whole camp. And the next slide is a map. So we'll start to relate this to the territory. But here's the work details. This is from testimony of Samuel Reisman's that was actually read into the U.S. congressional record in the late 1940s. But he listed them in groups, group 1 through 7, and talked about what those groups did as their work. Groups 1 through 5 are in what's called, and this gets very, very confusing, but it's called Camp 1 or the Living Camp, which is just one side of Treblinka. And then there's Camp 2 or the Death Camp, which is the part of Treblinka where the gas chambers are operated and where bodies are buried and later bodies are burned. So working in Camp 2 is Group 6 and Group 7. It's easy to understand what Group 7 does. Terribly, Group 6, of course, you can probably imagine, is not actually dentists. It's people who've been given the job of removing gold teeth so that the regime can profit off of those teeth even. These groups 1 through 5 are the ones that process the goods of those murdered at Treblinka or keep the camp buildings running. The Goldjuden are the ones who are put in charge of the wealth of gathering and inventorying and preparing to be sent off of the wealth taken from those murdered at the camp. And this ugly term Hofjuden, or court Jews, that goes back into medieval times, but the Nazis reconjured it for use inside this camp, is that, you might have heard them called prominent prisoners in other camps if you've read about them, or individuals with some sort of privilege. These are the people who actually have a semi-irreplaceable skill, like builders or roofing technicians, people who put together the camp and keep it running in the physical sense. So they also are the ones who have the most access to territory. They can walk around anywhere they want to or need to in the camp, because this is a strictly lethally controlled environment. People, to the Germans, are very, very replaceable. So if you're found outside of where you sleep, where you work, and the space in between it, they could start to think of you as being involved in some kind of resistance, and maybe that's going to be the end for that person. So you can't just wander around, and if that's the case, a resistance is then going to need individuals with access to the whole camp, especially if it's going to end up being armed resistance, excuse me, by getting a hold of weapons in some way. So those are the work groups. It is a strict separation. Before I move on, just want to say it's a really strict separation between Camp 1 and Camp 2. They're not supposed to be allowed to communicate between each other. They sleep in different parts of the camp. This is a strict, never moving separation, except for one person. And that one Jewish person who's allowed to go between the two becomes really important to resistance. So here is our first map of the camp. And on it, I wanted to point out that long missing from discussions of resistance were women in this camp, and what were women's jobs there? Did they participate in resistance? I'm working on a book about the camp, as I said, and mine will kind of restore them to this record. So here's, again, my fantastic graphic design ability, pointing out the 2 even rooms. It's this room of these rooms here of the Camp 2 barracks, and this room here of the Camp 1 barracks. Let me draw out that difference between Camp 1 and 2. So looking at my mouse, this line, which there it's a fence, and here it's a sand berm. This is separating Camp 1 and 2. This is Camp 2, or the death camp, Camp 1, or the living camp. And I said it gets really confusing, because down the road, there's also a Treblinka Roman numeral 1 that is a forced labor camp with many actually Polish political prisoner or resistant prisoners in it. It's a very different camp. It has nothing to do, for the most part, with the history of Treblinka Roman numeral 2, the extermination camp. But just because life gets confusing, there's also a Camp 1 and a Camp 2 inside of Treblinka 2. So now that I've probably confused you too much, I think I hopefully have gotten you on the page with how geography works here. But this is the prisoner sleeping barracks in Camp 1. It's this U-shaped building that the Nazis like to call the ghetto. And then it has its own fence around it. So it's supposed to be very hard to get out of, especially at night. This is the prisoner barracks in Camp 2. You can see it again, has a fence around it. So it's supposed to keep them in at night. Not a very observant group of guards, because their main method of guarding Jewish prisoners at night is just to lock these fences around these barracks and consider it done, and withdraw guarding around the rest of the place. So prisoners are always taking advantage of when they discover that these German guards are that least German of things, not very good at their jobs, which is absolutely necessary to how this resistance is going to come off. So we come back to Alfred Galewski. This is another one of these points where I think I can make this story pretty darn interesting if I can do it any justice at all. Like I said, there's really, really few pictures of the existence inside Treblinka. This photo is, we have to just live with it, it's what we've got. It's of the camp after the revolt. This building right here that still exists and is actually in stone is the German armory, the SS armory, where they kept their spare ammunition, weapons, hand grenades, so on and so forth. Everything was in there behind a locked door. And what's used to be here, but isn't anymore, remember that burning photo that we saw at the beginning, is two long barracks buildings that used to connect to either side of it. If you can see this line right here, that used to be a roof pitch. So you can see that this building sat linked up in between two buildings. Here it is on the map, right there, in between these two long buildings that are just gone in that photograph. But if a resistance plans to be an armed revolt, we've picked the people that we want, put them in the right positions, so get them access to the whole camp. Now you have geographic ability to get from place to B, A to B, by passing notes and information between people you trust that you put in those different areas. That's all set up. Now, how do you go from that to an armed revolt inside of an extermination camp? It sounds, and you know, it's logical to say that sounds impossible. It should have been impossible, but they came up with absolutely amazing ways to fool the guards into letting them pull that off. Of all things, the Germans could be brought into the idea of doing things by ideas to beautify or make more luxurious the camp for German living. So right here in front of these barracks buildings that used to exist, Alfred Galewski and others suggested to the Nazis that they allow them to put in like flower planters, kind of big wooden boxes that would contain soil. Now I'm explaining to you what, you know what a flower planter is, but they had to build them. So they suggest building them, and that building work gave them the ability to assign Jewish workers to the area right in front of the armory, with not just be right in front of the armory, but be right in front of the armory with something like a wagon or other wheeled thing that you could conceal weapons inside, right? So you could not just get into the armory maybe, but you'd have something that could carry weaponry to another part of the camp without being immediately seen. So that's one step. But how do you get into the armory? That comes down to the only imagery we have of it is, I'm going back to here to point out this representation of Alfred Bem. Long after the war, one of the ways that Samuel Willenberg decided to deal with his post-traumatic stress, to deal with all of his memories, was to sculpt them. He did this after his own retirement, so he did this late in life, but he went back into his memory and sculpted scenes of Treblinka. This is on the cover of his book, is another scene of the revolt at Treblinka, and this is a scene of Alfred Bem's later job, pushing a baby carriage around the German living area. And you can see inside it here that those are bottles. They're empty bottles. Much of life at this camp for the average German guard was their guard duties during the day and getting drunk at night. They took advantage of that drinking by saying to the Germans, Alfred Galewski again making this suggestion, every morning around here, there's a lot of bottles strewn around. It's kind of the morning after of your parties. Why don't you allow me to assign a prisoner to clean up? And the Germans said, oh, that's a great idea. Yeah, assign somebody to clean up. So who gets the job of cleaning up and being around that German SS area at the time they want him there? It's three well-trusted Jewish boys. They call them boys, but these probably are all kids we'd consider close to being men in today's thought. One of them was even a Polish army veteran. But Alfred Bem is one of them. You can see him pushing that cart. And another one is a probably about 14 or 15-year-old named Edek. I don't have his last name. He only comes down to us as Edek. But he is told to clean up around there. And while you're doing it, when no one's looking, walk up to the armory door lock and push a pin into the keyhole. He does that. And the Germans discover not the pin, because it's pushed down into the keyhole too far, but they discover that the lock is broken. They can't get their key all the way in there. So they order Jewish prisoners to remove the door from its hinges, take it over to the workshop, which just so happens to be inside the Jewish barracks building. It's actually right here, the locksmith's workshop. And then 2 locksmiths are commanded to fix the lock and make it a new key. And they do, but in the process, they make another key. And they keep that key for the resistance conspiracy. So now the Germans have a new key to a new door hung back up on that armory right there. And the Jewish prisoners who are planning a revolt have their own key. And they've gotten access to the area around that armory through their own suggestion of cleaning up after the nightly drinking. They've gotten access on the day of the revolt through their own suggestion to build these flower planters, and they get all of that, I'm just reiterating, through their own sort of hook and crook of coming up with ways to gain access to territory and do it through people that they trust. So on the day of the revolt, jumping back to the map, they have communication with Camp 2 through the prisoner construction supervisor, a man named Yaschik Viernik, who also wrote a book about Treblinka, and you could look up his book if you wanted to read more about this. These, by the way, at the bottom are all memoirs by, mostly memoirs by survivors, but this last one here is it's a family history written by a survivor's descendant. But going back to, this is the camp as it existed on the day of the revolt. Here's that armory. Here's the prisoner barracks in, here's the prisoner barracks in Camp 1. Here's that prisoner barracks in Camp 2. We have communication between the two because the construction foreman, Yaschik Viernik, is in on the resistance. We can go to right in front of, this even depicts it, see these kind of beautified areas in front of the barracks buildings. We can go here because they're building the planters on that day. They have the key. They've put work details they trust in different areas they intend to attack on the day of the revolt. Now it all comes down to a signal and carrying out the revolt on the day. So the signal is rudimentary. The signal was to be a gunshot. But prior to that gunshot, there was supposed to be pushing out all of the people who needed to be in a certain position, getting those people armed by bringing them a weapon or having them come to collect a weapon. All those stolen weapons taken out of the armory on the day of the revolt, because they couldn't take them out in advance, or a Nazi inventory might catch that they're gone. So all of those weapons are taken out and brought here to the camp kitchen where women work. And the Nazis had a tendency to not view Jewish women as a resistance threat. So the prisoners used that. The women were in on the resistance, and they held these rifles and stolen pistols and hand grenades with Jewish women because the Germans didn't suspect them. They thought of women as the weaker sex and incapable of taking part in the resistance. This is a terrible, terrible mistake for them. So this is a distribution point of weapons on the day of the revolt, and the other is over here. And in a talk that is about resistance as a whole, I don't go into usually the whole terrible catalog of violence perpetrated against women in this camp. Needless to say, most likely, it is the darkest part of the life inside this place. These 3 rooms right here toward the end of the barracks, and there were probably more than 3, are part of what you could call a camp brothel at Treblinka. There were 13 Jewish women who were forced to endure this place. It was for the use of the camp's Travniki, or non-German guards. Germans did take advantage of Jewish women at Treblinka, but not in this specific place. That's part of the larger history of sexual violence at this camp that I'm happy to go into in Q&A if that's something you want to hear more about, but I was keeping this closer to resistance today. So these women, though, we go into that history of what happened to them to talk about how they took part in resistance. There were 8 Travniki guards using that brothel at the time the revolt was to take off. Prisoner testimonies tell us that this place existed, and then survivor testimonies also tell us, and I'll close to quote here, that on the day of the revolt at the appointed time, our women distracted the guards inside that place. They say our, so I take that our to mean that these women are in on the plan. They're part of it. They're using the possessive. A man runs in to take the rifles that the guards had set down. That also proves what this place was about, because there's no other discernible place or reason a guard would set down a rifle in front of Jewish prisoners inside of this place. So those 8 rifles are run out of the brothel by a male prisoner who would run in to collect them. He is shot straight away as he's running out with them, but it appears that those 8 make it into the hands of other prisoners, because there's a lot of reporting about who was shooting in which area, and the only way to account for the amount of shooting or the amount of armed prisoners in Camp 2 is to take into account that these 8 rifles got out of that brothel. So also one of the points of attack is straight through this fence out this way. But we back up, say this is going to take place over there. How does the revolt begin? Unfortunately, it's about an hour, maybe 2 hours early, because of an emotional decision. One of the most feared guards is discovered. He discovers 2 prisoners in possession of cash. One of the best ways to prepare yourself individually for the post-revolt, if you're hoping that you're going to survive this revolt, you're going to get out of Treblinka, you're going to need cash. We can't gloss over the fact that most Polish people would have turned in Jewish individuals for money, and were doing that at quite a rate. So Jews knew that, and knew that the only way that they were going to be able to survive in the outside world was to be able to pay for shelter, pay for food, or bribe people to be quiet and give them hiding places. So they were taking the gold and valuables stolen from those murdered at Treblinka, taking that from the SS and putting it in their own pockets to fund their life on the run. That's why one of the chief rules of this camp was that anyone caught with gold or valuables at any time would be suspected of an escape attempt or resistance and immediately murdered. So this one guard discovers 2 people with cash on them and starts marching them toward a place of execution. They decided no one else was going to die that day before the revolt is pulled off, so they take a shot at him. It's early, it's too early. This plan is, if it has any major flaw, it's that it's far too complicated. Many more details go into this in the book length exploration of how it's supposed to come together, but the fact is that it's over planned, if you will. So they had it right down to when is somebody supposed to come get their rifle. Some had not, some weren't in their right attack position yet. In general, the moment that shot rang out, it was chaos. That chaos, however, how do we get to that black smoke? So let me say that black smoke and then wrap up how the revolt happened. But that black smoke is because of another one of their terrifically, there's almost nothing funny about how the history of this place works, but I always get a bit of a wry smile when I think about how they convinced the Germans to do this one thing. Nazi Germany used a great deal of propaganda against the Jewish people, accusing them of being carriers of typhus and lice and so on and so forth. And this is one of their major anti-Semitic themes, especially in propaganda in Poland. So the Jews inside of Treblinka actually used that against the Nazis themselves. They go to them and say, you know, this place could have a typhus outbreak. You know, Jews they're always full of lice. You should let us fumigate this place and spray it with chemical on a regular basis. And the Germans agree to this idea. And they assign a Jewish prisoner to go around with one of those backpack-mounted sprayers on a daily basis, and he sprays the exterior of buildings with chemical, what would you call it? Bug killer, whatever I should be saying. On the day of the revolt, however, they switch out his bug-killing chemicals with kerosene. And he walks around the whole camp, having been given the right to do that by the German guards, and he sprays down the camp in kerosene. And there's also, so we've got this whole area probably just basically doused in kerosene. And right here, there is a fuel storage tank in this area here for the Nazi garage, the guards' garage, where repairs on the camp's one vehicle and maintenance of it were done. And the prisoner who works there is also in on the revolt, and he fully plans to not really survive the revolt. He just wants to blow up the fuel storage and does so. So we have the blown up fuel storage, and we have all of the buildings of the camps sprayed in kerosene, and the throwing and use of grenades that were snuck out of the armory, and people also just torching or, you know, using lighters to set alight the buildings that are sprayed in kerosene. So that's how we get to that amazing column of black smoke coming out of Treblinka. But that plan does break. Some of the prisoners run out through this gate, which was open on the day of the revolt, open so that they could use this garden area. This gate between the two camps is also open, so a lot of prisoners from Camp 1 run, actually might be counterintuitive, but they run into Camp 2, link up with these prisoners, and go through the wall over here. There were probably around 600 to 700 prisoners alive in Treblinka on the day of the revolt. 300 of them make it out into the forest at some point on that day. So 300 make it out on that day. Probably, let's say it's 600, so we can just make the math easy. These are all iffy totals that we will never really know the exact numbers on. So anything is worth the argument. But let's say it's 600 on that day, 300 make it out, 200 are most likely killed in the process of the revolt, and 100 by German guard sources are left alive inside the camp at the end of the day. Of the 300 that make it out into the forest, at least 70, around 70 of them survive the next 21 months of war and the Holocaust still raging. Because if you pull off a revolt at Treblinka on August 2nd, 1943, you've got a long way to go still to make it to the end of the war and the end of the Nazi regime. But many did. Many were recaptured. Probably over 200 were recaptured after that revolt. But a major success of the Treblinka uprising is the individuals that were saved by that resistance and the knowledge that was saved along with them. So I'm going to turn at this point to a real short, before we can have a conversation, any questions you might have, real short kind of touting of what these survivors were able to accomplish in their post-war years. Justice, I want to say before I go into these accomplishments as it goes to justice, what even would be justice for 925,000 murders? It's an incalculable thing. There's nothing that rises to justice for that crime. But they tried. They did something. And I like to at least give them some recognition for that as well. So between the 70 or so survivors of that day and escapees and people who were transported through Treblinka, so far I've identified 253 survivors. And many of them become very, very zealous witnesses for the courts. It's have trial, will travel. They'll go just about anywhere to take part in a trial against Treblinka guards. This, by the way, is a photograph of an early 1945. I think it's 1945. I could be slightly off on the date. Treblinka survivor reunion. Of course, it's not anywhere near all of them. These men actually thought at the time that they might have been the only people who survived, but it turns out, of course, there were many other survivors that come forward later. This is that first ever reunion photo, though it takes place in post-war Poland. But to talk about trials for a second, the first Treblinka witnesses to testify in a court are already taking part in proceedings in post-war Austria and investigations that went on there, post-war investigations in West Germany and East Germany and Ukraine and Russia, and what was called the Extraordinary State Commissions in what would become Soviet Poland or Communist Poland. So it's early as often, and it's very full participation. I have the Nuremberg trials on the list as well, because Treblinka survivor witnessed statements also are taken into the immediate Nuremberg trials. And then you might be looking at this map of the United States going, what the heck happened there? But there are proceedings against Travniki guards who snuck into the United States, having concealed their identity as former members of SS Guard organizations. And those take place in Florida, Michigan, Ohio, Illinois, I should have had on that list, and DC. Incredibly, I have a colleague who's writing about these. I'd be very interested to see if her eventual book probably will parallel this. But a man named Fedor Fedorenko was a guard at Treblinka and found living in Florida, and a denaturalization proceeding against him was attended by 6 Treblinka survivors, made the trip to Florida to testify against him. He was stripped of his American citizenship at the height of the Cold War and deported to then Soviet Ukraine, where he was executed for his crimes, his having taken part in being a guard at Treblinka. It's an absolutely remarkable thing, because in the height of the Cold War, the United States and the USSR, of course, not a very cozy relationship, and very few people were sent from the United States to the Soviet Union. That's just practically unheard of. So they participate in these trials. There are 2 major trials in Germany after the war. Those take place in Dusseldorf. There's the Kurt Franz trial with one of the main guards and about 10 total German guards alongside him. And then the later trial in 1970 of Franz Stangl, who was the second and longest serving commandant of the camp. Treblinka survivors secure a 85 to 90% conviction rate for their guards, when the conviction rate for Germans who had been in any part of the regime is incredibly low. And German courts really demand that you prove both motive and that you have witness testimony. So Belzec did not have a revolt. It's one of the 3 Aktion Reinhardt camps. There was no Belzec revolt. There's thought that one was being planned when the camp was closed down and just didn't quite happen. But only 2 Jews survived Belzec, and no Belzec guards were ever convicted of crimes. Sobibor also had a revolt, at least 55 survivors. I think that number is going to go up with research done by others as well. And they had a fairly better record of convicting their guards. But Treblinka's record of convicting guards and the sentences, we shouldn't even go into the sentences. I'll just say immediately that I would totally agree the sentences are in no way commensurate with the crimes committed by these guards, but they at least got them a sentence and were able to use the courtrooms as fora to disseminate what had happened at Treblinka. And that's where a lot of the research information that I use comes from, is from these court trials. So they are writing the history as they're in there attempting to prosecute their own guards. So one final thing that they accomplish, if I can lead you through a very kind of convoluted way that the law works, after 1968, trials of German guards inside Germany pretty much dry up, because you might be shocked to learn that the crime of murder actually has a statute of limitations in Germany. So it has to be a specific level of that crime for very difficult to prove motive-based reasons for an individual to be convicted after 68. And at first, that ruling also applies to accessory to commit murder. They say that accessory to commit murder is also outside of the statute of limitations, and there aren't probably going to be more guard trials for any camp, that is, from 1968. Well, you may have heard of, especially if you have a Netflix subscription. I'm not a big fan of this series of documentaries, but you may have heard of The Devil Next Door, this trial series about a man believed to be Ivan Demjanjuk, or John Demjanjuk, this person right here, with Lawrence Douglas's great book, The Right Wrong Man. Here's how Treblinka survivors have their last amazing success that lasts to this day, if you follow the convoluted path of how this post-war legal system worked. There is that statute of limitations. The Germans don't intend to have more trials against Nazis that took part in crimes at any camps. But then John Demjanjuk is found living in Ohio in the United States and believed to be a Nazi guard. I shouldn't say a Travniki guard who worked at Treblinka at the gas chamber. They believe him to be Ivan the Terrible, Ivan Demjanjuk. So he is taken in by the United States eventually. He is stripped of his citizenship and deported to Israel to stand trial. He stands trial in Israel. He is convicted. Then there is new evidence discovered that he's not that Ivan. He actually worked at Sobibor, we now know. But on appeal, his appeal is his conviction is overturned. But the appearance of several Treblinka survivors at this trial makes his crimes at Sobibor and elsewhere impossible to ignore. The United States won't take him back. No one feels that it's right to let him live out his days in, of all places, Israel. So the Germans are forced to change their own legal system to admit him to Germany, because he's Ukrainian. He was never a German. So the German government had tried to get away with not putting him on trial there for those reasons. His crimes he's not a German, his crimes didn't happen in Germany, so on and so forth. They tried to use these excuses. But public pressure internationally, because of the testimony brought forth by Treblinka survivors, forces them to take in Ivan Demjanjuk, and they're going to put him on trial for his crimes at Sobibor when he dies. But the precedent has been changed. The statute of limitations is off the crime of accessory to commit murder. And it's because of that change brought about through the Demjanjuk trials that you get the later trial against Oskar Gröning, a former Nazi guard from Stutthof, and the more recent, this was 2021, if you heard that that just fascinating story of a 96-year-old female guard trying to flee justice and being captured in Germany. I know of at least one trial against guards in their 90s still going on to this day. And if I can go back for a second through this kind of convoluted mess of how we got from Treblinka to there, just for a second, it is because I want to give them the credit of having brought forth to the courtroom such powerful testimony that the German state and the world were not able to ignore that these men were living, men and women, were living out their days in comparative peace and comfort when they had taken part in these crimes, and that this statute of limitations was unpalatable after being forced to look at it. And I give that to another victory of resistance at Treblinka. And I will stop share there and pass it around to questions if there are any. And I'll just start by saying thank you all so much for the invitation back to Nebraska, which was absolutely fantastic to be there, even if virtually. To bring some of this research that started down the street from you back to Omaha was just a pleasure. So thanks so much. Gary, if I'm calling out, I didn't know if I was going to do that, but please.
My question has to do with you had 70 survivors, and then all of a sudden you had a photo that said 253 survivors.
Mhm.
So if 73 out of the 300 who escaped survived, where are you getting the 253 from?
Right. That's a great question. Let me clean that up a little. I mentioned only briefly that it's 70 survivors of the day of the revolt. Then off the top of my head, 77 more are escapees, people who escaped prior to the revolt, because the camp, as I detail in longer research, really not great guards. So I'm just putting that very, very mildly. They came from a different part of the Nazi system, and they were not well-trained guards of a camp. And there were a lot of opportunities to escape up to a certain date when things were changed by Stangl to reorganize the camp. And 77 of those individuals in that 253 are escapees prior to the revolt. And then please don't make me do math because I'm a humanities major, but you've got 70, 77, and then the rest are through transport. They got to Treblinka and then were sent somewhere else. And then there's some really strange one-off cases in there as well. There was a musician, person who was forced to play music for the Nazis, who's the only person I know of who they decided not to murder him at the end of the camp, and he was sent from Treblinka II to Treblinka I after Treblinka had been closed. So he survived through German means, but for the most part, you've got three main categories. You've got revolt day, escape prior to revolt, and through transport survivors. And then I've got a question from Mark Kirchhoff in the chat, and I'll read that out loud for the recording. It says, how do you get the detailed information about which building was used for what? The fact that people ran through a gate, men sent first, then women, and so many other details. Great series of questions. They basically all have the same answer, which is to say, I get that from survivor testimonies in the form of the earliest are written court investigation documents that might be to the Polish Extraordinary State Commission or to there's a Viennese investigation going on that a lot of 1947 dated documents come from. Then there's those German trials. Then there's USC Shoah Foundation later recordings from the 80s, 90s. A man named Boder from the Illinois Institute of Technology. I think it's David Boder. I'm having a brain cramp though on his full name. He recorded some of the earliest oral histories from the DP camp days onward. And those are housed at IIT in Illinois. A couple of them come from that. Yale Fortunoff Video Archive. The simple answer, though, is that you get all of these things from either the spoken statement or written statement of survivors, because almost every scrap of German documentation was destroyed or never even created for this camp. That's another big difference I could have, maybe should have gone into when it comes to this place versus a Auschwitz, is that Auschwitz is really, really well documented. They attempt to destroy everything there. They blow up 2 of the gas chambers, so on and so forth. We know the story of what's left at Auschwitz and what's not. When it comes to the Aktion Reinhard camps, there was, first off, an intention never to document the places in such a way. And secondly, an intention to destroy all of that documentation once all 3 of those camps are shut down. And they do that even to the case of eradicating all physical traces of the camp as far as they can, try to do. So that's, why these camps are now only memorials. They don't have original buildings at them. So guys, just basically one more long story short on that is that all these things come from the memories and writings of survivors, which of course have their ups and downs, and you have to kind of try to test them against each other. You have to try to weave testimonies together in a way that makes sense. Try to, sometimes you have to pick the one that seems correct when they disagree on things, because there's a little bit of playing historical telephone that goes on in that kind of sources, but you work your way through it as a historian and try to make your best educated conclusions. So I'm going to go to another one in the chat here. And I have Marty Rosen Atherton asks, were you able to meet any of the survivors personally? How many, if any, are still living? Yes, thank you for that question. It gives me an opportunity to talk about Samuel Willenberg. So I was able to correspond with Samuel Willenberg in the last year of his life. He passed away in 2016. I talked to him actually, and he sent me things to my office at the University of Nebraska while I was there. So that's another Nebraska connection for me on this. But I was talking to him while he was still with us. He lived in Tel Aviv area. He lived in Israel, and I got some letters from him. And he sent me a signed copy of his book I'd already read, but of course I cherish it. I have a letter from him framed on my office wall, and he was the last survivor of the revolt itself to pass away. There is a man named Leon Pesach Poldek Ritz. It's always a little bit of a challenge to say that one correctly. He goes by Leon Ritz. He lives in Sweden. Who is a prior escapee. He was not there on the day of the revolt, but he, through his own brilliance and conniving, managed to escape the camp prior to the revolt. And last I knew, he is still with us. I believe he might be a centenarian by this point, but I've spoken with his son. He's just another amazing, remarkable person who survived this place. And then I've got another question from Gary in the chat here. It says, in your archive research, do you attempt to find any blueprints for the camp? I guess the real answer would be no. I didn't make an attempt because the story that I've laid out there is pretty conclusive that, well, one, there were no blueprints for this camp. It's more of an organically constructed, the way they kind of needed it on the place sort of camp. Auschwitz has those amazing, you can even watch that 6-part BBC documentary that's largely driven by the archival documents and architectural drawings side of that camp history. But this camp doesn't have that, and it certainly doesn't exist. I've been to all the archives where such a thing would exist. It does not appear to. You never, as a historian, want to say no, because next thing you know, that'll pop up and I'll look like a fool. But it would very seemingly conclusively seem that there was no architectural blueprint ever created, and certainly none that exists today.
I asked that because we found a metal tag. I think it's called Beetle. It's a German term that's associated with blueprints at Sobibor. But we have not found an archive to go test that. So there's a number and a tag, a metal tag, and that would have accompanied some type of drawing. So I would guess if there would, what's that?
Do you worry that it maybe accompanied a prisoner who thought they might be carrying on their work as an architect in some slave labor capacity and ends up on
it's a German word, it's a German, it's a German tag. So, if you were going to search for something, where would you search for it becomes the next question, because it would be the same question I would ask you for Treblinka, because they didn't just build these willy-nilly. There was a definite plan for these camps.
Of a sort. I think
there's similarities. There's similarities in the camps.
Yeah. There's similarities in the camps. There's similarities in their building and their builders. I meant to say.
That's right.
Like one person going from one to the next to carry on that building. So I think that even a lot of that plan is in that person's head. There's probably at some point, they're most likely, because it's just the best construction process, there probably was some sort of drawing of the gas chamber as they were building it. What becomes of it thereafter, I bet it's destroyed. I've got an article out, 2018, called Lessons from the Treblinka Archive, where I talk about the difficulty of finding sources on this place and how that has for 80 years impacted what we know about it. The point of the article being that I'm sure you've discovered about Sobibor too, that like there is no, people have a tendency to imagine or think that somewhere in the world there's a building that says Treblinka Archive on it, and there isn't. You have to piece these things together from all the different places they may have ended up for one reason or another that appear pretty convoluted to us today at times. So that's why seem comes back that I just said comes back to me, like I shouldn't be as strict in my interpretation that it'll never happen, but it seems pretty unlikely to me, unfortunately.
All right. Well, thank you so much for sharing that with us and for answering all of those questions. We really appreciate it. And thank you so much for answering those.
Oh, thank you. Thank you to everybody who attended and will watch it on your YouTube in the future. And I'm just really, again, overjoyed to get the invite. And
all right. Well, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.